My talk's going to have kind of 4 chapters to it. And if we get short on time, I will breeze through one of them. And I'm sure there's a lot that I'm going to gloss over. So please feel free to ask questions at the end of the presentation. And even though my mom is in the audience, you can ask difficult questions. It's okay, I won't be embarrassed by that. Okay, rendering sensible invisibilities around architectures of internment. I will unpack what each one of those terms means as I'm using them through the course of the presentation. And so hopefully that will all become quite clear. Okay, here we go. And I'm going to start with a little prelude to get us kind of in the mood. So this video contains within it, this video contains within it a number of the seeds for the research that would follow. In it, we see on one level, the invisible intern in the architecture office doing the work of erasing, which is usually a part of the work that an architect does that never gets talked about. There's also a series of other kinds of relationships of viewing of other people or protagonists, if you will, who are in the room. There's the observer, that's the camera filming this performance for camera. There's what I call the government view, or this kind of oblique view, the low-flying airplane capturing this landscape perspective of an internment camp being demolished. There is the imagined architect's plan view, if we put ourselves in the position of the intern. And of course, there's probably also the interned, who's the person within the drawing. We see the unmaking of a drawing as opposed to the act of making it. We see the waste and the detritus that comes from the demolition, which is usually the part of architecture that we don't pay too much attention to. There's also the remaking in the drawing that corresponds to the rebuilding of some of the components of the Monsonar internment camp, which is what this drawing represents. And this sets the tone for many of the things that would come later. But most of all, it's this complex web of relationships of people whose stories about these camps that are actually latent within this video. And in addition to that, there was the unexpected, though it shouldn't have been unexpected, absolutely annoying, horrifying sound of the flat blade razor that those of us of a certain generation would remember using as the tool for erasing. And so part of the effective nature of, or effective power of the work was actually the unanticipated sonic component. The rhythm and the sound would be things that would come back in the work that I would do in the months and years that would follow this. So part one, the invisibilities around architectures of internment. And let me just introduce this notion of this parentheses, which suggests an oscillation between both the visible and the invisible, and we'll see this occurring throughout. So what are these camps? What are camps? First of all, the camp, as Giorgio Agamben points out, is the space that opens up when the state of exception starts to become the rule. It's a space, it's a fold in space and a fold in government in which the law is no longer carried out, and those people within that space are beyond the law, not protected by the law. And similarly, it's also important to understand who are these people? Why are they there? They're not criminals. They're not there because of something that they have done. They're there strictly because of qualities around their identity, whether that's racial, cultural, religious, or some political identity. And I think that some of these terms that are used both by researchers and philosophers really get at the way in which dominant culture or the governments at those times considered these populations undesirable, the enemy alien, or as Judith Butler refers, the ungrievable. So this project drew from two different case studies, each of which a camp or set of camps called about through executive order. So the first is a series of camps formed in the western part of the United States, 4 of 10 camps amongst 18 other assembly centers that were brought about through Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066 in February of 1942 as a direct response to the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And this executive order, if we think about it, these texts, these pieces of writing, these enunciations, these performative acts, or what I would call governmental utterances, are things that produce spatial conditions. They produce an exclusion zone, and in fact, 2 exclusion zones in different phases from which certain populations were denied the right to travel or even to reside. And so the gray space that you see along the western part of the United States and even reaching into southern Arizona was the first space from which people of Japanese American descent were excluded. And then that expanded into the entirety of California and pushed even farther north into the state of Arizona. And of course, one of the reasons why I began thinking about these spaces was not only literally tripping over the remains of one of the associated spaces in our backyard in Arizona, but I had a kind of stinking feeling about what might be coming down the pike if certain people were going to be elected as the next president of the United States. And not surprisingly, once that person was in office on their first weekend, we found that there were new executive orders that reinforced the use of spaces that invisibilize people behind barbed wire. The second case study, similarly, is a space called about through executive order. In this case, it's the state of emergency law that was first written in France in the mid-50s in order to restrict movement of Algerians in the French departments in Algeria, with Algeria being France at that time. And similarly, this executive order limited the movements and the places where people could reside. And eventually it would be declared not 2 times, but ultimately 6 times. And the case that I'm studying here is its 3rd iteration when it began to actually have an impact in metropolitan France, in the Paris region, in the Bois de Vincennes, which is on the eastern part of Paris, as Nancy called out. And this law, unlike FDR's executive orders, actually never really went away. It's actually been declared 6 times, the 6th of which was in 2015 in response to the Bataclan bombing. And then portions of that law actually have been slowly but surely folded into permanent parts of French law to control and restrict people's movements and the places where they're able to reside. And I want to point out just one short passage which I've translated here, which will become important later on for some of the work. And that is this kind of slippery slope of the text that moves from a definition of those people who are subject to this law as being people whose activities pose a threat to security or public order, to those about whom we think that there are serious reasons that their behavior constitutes a threat. So it goes from acts to behaviors and opinions. And I think that this is a really important and quite terrifying state of things. And as I said, this will come back in the work later on. So how do we know about these camps? I'm going to talk first about the 4 camps that I studied. As I said, there were 10 of them in the Western United States. And in 4 of those camps, those people who were American citizens, thus not first generation who had come from Japan to America, but those who were born here and who were of Japanese American descent, they were citizens. And those citizens were eligible to be employed while being interned in a camp to weave camouflage for, and I think what got me on this project in many ways was the kind of perversion of a group of people who has been made invisible because they have been displaced from their homes on the west coast of the United States into a camp, and then are employed by the government that put them there to weave devices of obfuscation for the army. Quite a complex little knot that just grabbed my imagination, and I needed to take that further. So how do we know about these camps? We know about the camps through well-published and readily available documents today, though that was probably not always the case. We see kind of choreographic scores, if you will, of the US government's plans to relocate these populations in phases from the various counties and regions along the West Coast into the particular assembly centers and then relocation centers, or what we would now call internment camps. And we know the camps as well, again, because they're incredibly accessible, well-published documents of the War Relocation Authority's original drawings, the master plans of the camps. And in each one of these, you see not only the overall composition in the landscape and larger kind of infrastructures, but we also always see the kind of DNA, the kind of typical block somewhere on the drawing, which is a series of barracks in parallel lines, housing approximately 350 people, one mess hall, one recreation center, and a series of other outbuildings to support the life of that local community, showers, latrines, etc. We also know about the camps from government photographs, propaganda films that show the volunteers, the pioneers, which is what they were called, the volunteer internees who went early to the sites to actually participate in the construction of the camp, where they would then spend the next 3.5 years of their lives. And we know them through the aerial photographs of photographers hired by the WRA to document the construction. We also know about the camps, again, through these kind of propaganda, if you will, or documentation by the government showing the various forms of labor that was conducted within the camps. And I was particularly interested, partially because of this question of weaving camouflage in the various forms of labor that were going on there. And so I chose to focus on 4 camps, 2 in California and 2 in Arizona, in which camouflage was woven. But in addition to that, in one of these, on the left, we're seeing somebody working in a woodworking shop, making scale wooden models of ships that would be used by the US Navy to train people to identify German boats. And in Poston, within the Colorado River Indian community, we see the molding of adobe bricks. Why these 3 things? In many ways, because all 3 of them in some way have something to do with visibility or invisibility, disappearance, hiding, identifying those who are trying to hide, or just materials that we would normally not think of as building materials and that disappear when left exposed to the weather without care. We also know about the camps through eyewitness images. And as I already pointed out, this image on the left is really the image that kind of seized my imagination and had me thinking about what the life within these camps might be. And here we see, these are both photographs by Dorothea Lange, taken in Monsonar in California. But they also, in addition to showing the labor that people were involved in, they also give a sense of the atmosphere and what was prominent in almost all of these sites was the dust and the wind. And this as well would be a kind of theme that would come back again and again, not only through the evidence of this in the photographs, but also what I would encounter when I would go to the sites. And I would also encounter the trace of these things in the journals, the diaries of people who had been interned in these camps. So beyond these things coming from archives, from the government, from eyewitness documentation, and from the internees themselves, I would also make my own journey to these 4 camps to see what, if anything, remained. At the Santa Anita camp, which today is a massive parking lot outside of the racetrack, which served as one of the places of internment, today we essentially find a blackened over camp, what I would go on to call a kind of redacted space. I would find in Monsonar a cleaned up, tidied up, well erased, but also partially reconstructed camp where there would be a kind of simulation of what the barracks would have been like in the past. At Poston, I would see some traces that appeared in the maps, but I would also see new conditions, alfalfa being grown and other kinds of things. So a kind of palimpsest of both traces from the days of the camp and new kinds of activities happening. And then in the Gila River Indian community, just between Tucson and Phoenix, I would find quite a different situation in which the camps were partially abandoned in the middle of the state of demolition. And so heaps and piles of broken up concrete, wood, and the literal traces from where cast iron pipes had been ripped out of the slabs. And I would come to think of this site as a scarred site, one that is where the wounds are still very, very clearly evident. So based on my experience coming to know these camps through what I would call the renditions of the site by the various protagonists, I would begin to explore the Centre d'Identification de Vincennes, the identification center in the Bois de Vincennes in Paris, through a similar kind of approach. And here, rather than the federal government, I was looking into the archives of the police. I had heard of this camp many times in conversations about the Algerian War, and that it was in particular a place where vast quantities of Algerian men were taken after a series of peaceful demonstrations, October 17th of 1961. So I looked through the archives of the police department, and which primarily consists of memos, pieces of writing, giving instructions about buying more blankets, spoons, meals to feed people, what to be built, what to be demolished. But I would find 2 images, this being one of them. A kind of cryptic plan that accompanied a building contractor's bid to install loudspeakers and microphones in this place. Not a lot to go on. I would also then look through the National Geographic Institute's aerial photographs from the period and ultimately find what seemed like a configuration of buildings more or less of the same configuration. So a hunch. I think that perhaps this place is the place that is written about in the police department archives. But I can't know for sure. There are too many rumors that say that this place, this notorious place, was somewhere else. So I would look and look for about 6 months finding not a lot of corroborating evidence, but finding many other fascinating things, amongst them even just the faded carbon copy letters and triplicate and quadruplicate, the stamps and the clips and the indentations of the paper in all of these archival documents that would ultimately become the kind of substitute for the site, for the lack of being able to even know for sure where the site really was. I would also turn to documents from witnesses, humanitarian aid groups, and other government employees who would go to the camp. And I would find one woman's narrative, a woman named Monique Herveau, who was a political activist and went to live amongst the Algerian community in La Folie, in one of the kind of shanty towns on the western side of Paris, many of whom landed up spending time in the CIV. And so I would get a sense, kind of second, third hand, of the kind of physical experience and impact of being in that space. And I would go visit that place that I thought might be the camp, but it would be a long time before I would know for sure. So part two, I want to talk a little bit about invisibilities around architectural labor, and particularly thinking about these through the lens of performance. And so going back to that early video that I showed. So first, one thing I started to ask myself was about the difference between the term labor and work, and how certainly artists and architects tend to obsess with the work, the thing that we make, the object, the outcome, and oftentimes glancing over the seemingly endless labor, the red lines, the drawing and the erasing that happens. And would it be possible to reimagine what a practice is if one intended a little bit more attention to the labor rather than the work? And so as I started to think about this relationship between laboring and work, I began to think about that even in what we normally think of as a, well, we know it's not a straight line from the early idea to the end. There are many loopings back and undoing and redoing, a kind of cycle of forward and backward motion of making things visible and making them disappear and redoing them again. And then also starting to ask myself, what if we began to think about even that, not just in a line, but rather in a kind of a loop that actually acknowledges all of these other parts of the life of the building and the labor that is associated with that. Thus, the maintaining, the unmaking, and the remaking of architectural space. What happens when we start to think about the people and the communities who are involved in the making, and the precarious work situations and the materials where they come from and how they're assembled on site or made in our shops at home? And what happens if we start to really think about the precarious lives of the people who are actually involved in the making of our buildings? What happens if we draw from the work of artists and think about some of these other phases of the making, the maintenance, the unmaking, and the remaking? So I turned to people like Meryl Letterman-Ukles, who thinks about maintenance as an artistic practice and the never-ending labor that is part of making art, or just life, as she would say. Turning to somebody like Gordon Matta Clark, helped think about the unmaking of buildings and all of the things that lie underneath any kind of site or ground where we're going to project a project. I'm going to skip through some of these just in the interest of time. But one of the things that came forward in Matta Clark's work was this celebration of the unmaking and really thinking about exposing hidden aspects of our built environment. And then and lastly, in terms of the remaking, Yvonne Rainer, choreographer and filmmaker, her work was instructive in terms of thinking about not just remaking, but remaking endlessly again and again without any kind of goal in mind, seemingly kind of interminable labor. But also the fact that it's the doing of the work that is the work itself. Both the effort of doing the work is the creative work. And that was something that I had already been exploring in performances and works that I had been making in years previously. So it made a lot of sense to think about her attitude towards performance, stage space, and the fact that perhaps there really is no kind of outcome to this work. It's a cyclic, repetitive series of labor actions, and that the affect, the real content of the work, is through those cycles of repetition. And lastly, one of the things that I also thought was quite interesting in her work was this notion of the impossibility of doing it well, and that through the things that go wrong, discovering other opportunities, other possibilities. And that would certainly speak to me and was clearly evident in my very poor erasure of a drawing of the Monsignor internment camp. So part 3, I'm starting to assemble these different things: labor, the camp, invisibility, visibility, other senses, other ways of thinking about practice. So architecture usually is projective. We make models because we're projecting some future condition. We are imagining a world that doesn't exist yet, and we use our tools of drawing and model making to imagine as well as call forth, not unlike executive orders. These are instruments for calling forth future spatial conditions. And while most aspects of the Japanese American internment camps were designed by the Army, there were architects working under the Farm Security Administration who helped, who were part of the teams who designed fragments of the camps, usually the kind of anomalous spaces like this amphitheater or the administrator's housing or buildings that didn't fit into the repetitive pattern of the camp. But if you put aside this notion of drawing and modeling serving this projective action, the arrow going in one direction towards the future, and you then start thinking about using architectural techniques forensically to understand things of the past, why we draw, how we draw, or how we use any of our tools as architects starts to take on other meaning. So another practice, in addition to the 3 visual/performance artists I already referenced, A.L. Weissman and his lab Forensic Architecture also was incredibly important for helping me think about how to use drawing and modeling in a different way, and to think about the evidence that might be latent within modes of representation. So I would eventually become much more of a detective in the second case study as I was looking for a camp that I couldn't find, that nobody knew really where it was, unlike all of the camps in the US, which are highly, highly documented. So I would piece this together from things like an identification that it's used to be a garage. And that, yes, there are some terms on the drawings that reference automobiles, gasoline, paint shops, and things like that. And I would scrutinize these drawings and say, like, I have a hunch, but yet something is missing. I would look between these drawings to try and figure out what other kinds of information I could find. Government documents would give me some confidence because they would describe the size of the plot and that it was in the middle of the forest, or that it was on a particular road, but I would not know, they would never actually identify what address on that road. So I would do what architects do. I would look for the kinds of drawings, documents that an architect looks for, such as a building permit or a demolition permit. And yet I would come up empty-handed. The result of my search was that no document fits your search constraints. And at the moment, I felt quite disheartened by this, but eventually, again, borrowing some perspectives on the matter from A.L. Weissman, I would eventually realize this is actually not a dead end. This is in fact what he refers to as negative evidence. The absence of evidence sometimes is in fact the proof that you're looking for. And what this was proof of was that in fact this garage, the reason why its building and demolition permits were not in the Paris archives was because it was built physically in a place that today we call France, but at that particular moment in time was not France. It was occupied France. And in fact, yes, it was a garage. It was a garage that had been built by the Nazis and that the police department would eventually occupy and use for their own purposes. So I would eventually find one document that would put the words garage, Germans, and a description of the number of rooms that matched the drawing. And it was only that one document that eventually served as a way of corroborating that, yes, in fact, this cluster of buildings seen in these aerial photographs is the place. But again, referring back to A.L. Weissman, another kind of way of thinking that's introduced is thinking about the threshold of detectability and how when we scrutinize the media and we think about what is the medium or the technology that I'm looking at, we might find that there's actually information that's hidden within the media itself, but that there are traces. Or as the German artist Hito Steo says, you have to look for the rogue pixels that hide in the cracks of old standards of resolution. So what are the rogue pixels that are hidden in this aerial photograph that I looked at for so very long? And those rogue pixels are in fact the shadows of people in the courtyard. And they are the shadows of the bus, and they are the shadows of the buildings that would allow me to eventually not to try and draw a building in the way one normally draws the building, but rather to draw the shadows. And eventually, from the shadows, to be able to construct the volume of the buildings themselves. These are what I would go on to call unrenders, ghostly, skeletal drawings that really contain nothing but the trace of the few things that I know that can be known, which are the beds and their disposition in space, and the shadows of the buildings that give a sense of what the volume might have been, but no more than that. So based on all of this research, the question was how to make these spaces not just visible, because we have access to many documents, certainly of the Japanese American camps. And in the last couple of years, given the 75th anniversary of FDR's executive order, there has been a kind of reissuing, republication of many of these images. The challenge is to go beyond the images and think about how can the other senses help to actually make sense of these conditions. How do these go from being what Bruno Latour would say, from matters of fact to matters of concern? Or as an architect, I would say going beyond matters of concern, matters that matter in the sense that they become materialized as things that we can actually experience, as aesthetic experiences, and thus things that are available to the senses that help us make sense. So my task would be to think about how both the materialities and the choreographies of either performers or publics would help one make sense of not just the camps that were, but also the recurrence of the camp. So I'm going to talk about this through the three primary instruments that we use in architecture: models, drawings, and texts. So a first kind of cross-section will be about explorations through making and unmaking models, and thus the appearance and disappearance, or the oscillation between visibility and invisibility through this cyclical making and unmaking of models. My decisions about what to make and how to make it, of course, drew from the examples that I had from the studies of the camp: weaving camouflage, making scale models, molding things from things that seem without value or are just there. And I was embarking on this in a moment where the airwaves were full of a particular term: fake news. And of course, a readily available material were the newspapers from members of the local community who I corralled into offloading their newspapers, whatever they thought the real news was, that could then become the core material that would then be molded into not adobe bricks, but a brick slash barrack scale model at 1/8 of an inch equals a foot. A kind of odd brick, a little long for a brick, but close enough that it might pass for a brick. And I would explore, with the help of friends, working with these models to make and unmake not just the kind of standard DNA pattern of the Japanese American internment camps, but also those other places where people are disappearing today very close by. The 4, 5 different immigrant detention centers that are just up the road in Florence or Eloy, Arizona. And that would then become a score for 3 evenings of performances of making and unmaking the camp, and referring in a way to the work of Yvonne Rainer, this cyclical act of labor which seems to arrive at no conclusion. it just continues this action of the making and the unmaking. In addition to thinking about all of these things, I referred back to those points of view, those people who left traces for us to know about the camps, these folks I refer to as the protagonists, and their perspectives would influence the way I would also go on to document the work. So thinking about the architect's plan view, thinking about that low-flying airplane getting an oblique view of the landscape, and thinking about the witness on the ground observing the weaving of the camouflage, or in this case, the making and the unmaking of the models. It was also important to think about the actual sites themselves, not merely present this highly abstract action, but to bring documentation that I had made in the actual internment camps into the space of the performance/installation. And so on the screen that you see in the background were similar actions of making and unmaking models that I had conducted at Santa Anita, Monsanar, Poston, and Gila. I was also very interested in sometimes just letting things go and making clear that it's important that there are moments for absolute total chaos, absolute agency, and self-determination within this regimented rhythm of the making and the unmaking of the camp. So there were also moments in which the people who participated in the performances were asked to make something that was not this repetitive labor, but something that would be playful, comforting to themselves, just something to be a kind of interregnum between these disciplined moments. And as I would go on to document the work at the end of the PhD, I would also, in addition to including the documentation, elements of the actual labor or the fabrication of the things would also be part of the exhibition. So in this last exhibition that took place in December of last year, there was the kind of challenge of how does one actually exhibit performances? And so part of the task was spacing and the placing of the documentation of the past events that would then choreograph the movement of the conflict through an environment with the video footage from these different points of view that would also invite them to be a body engaging with the space in a number of different ways, engaging with video footage and objects at different scales. So sometimes demanding that you stand back in order to get an overview of the space, and at times asking you to get up close and personal, such as the video that was playing on an iPhone attached to the desk where the executive order is in the process of being written. So as I began my talk, I was presenting the drawing that we usually make being unmade, being erased, being undone. And I would continue to work through drawing throughout the entirety of the research, both looking at these existing drawings that the War Relocation Association had made, but then going on to create my own drawings for each one of these camps as a way of coming to know them. The drawing is a way of projecting yourself into the space, but the drawing was also an opportunity for me to draw comparisons between them and also draw comparisons with those contemporary camps here in Arizona that are currently the immigrant detention centers, which you're seeing on the right. And while I had already explored questions of erasure of drawing, I was also interested in what happens if the drawing itself becomes performative. What scale might it occur at, and how might I change this from occurring in a studio in the normal space where an architectural drawing is made to some other kind of place like the public domain, where there's constantly labor being enacted, but usually in ways that we don't pay attention. We don't see those people engaged in those tasks that are happening in public space. So another iteration was the production of one of these drawings using a material that would ultimately erase itself through rain and people's footsteps on the pavement, and asking myself, to what extent does the labor disappear in the midst of the activity in the street? The kind of final iteration of the drawing exploration took place in Paris, not on the horizontal surface, but on a building facade. And this was a work that I made at the same time that Dorothea Lange's photographs of the camouflage weavers was on exhibition elsewhere in Paris. And one of the things that I had wanted to explore in this project was really foregrounding the labor, whereas the earlier works, it was more about the pattern, the repetitive cycle of the making and the unmaking. The pattern itself seemed to take over. And in this case, I wanted to really shift the focus onto the actual act of labor, and again, this kind of a Sisyphean loop. And so here you're seeing the score that I used to convey the kind of arc of the action to the colleagues who are going to participate in what would become not only a drawing, but also an erasure, or a kind of a triple erasure, because the first thing we had to do was to make the drawing surface from which we would then go on to erase the drawing of the camp. And do this not as the kind of invisible intern in the architectural office or the invisible labor in our midst, but hyper visible on the facade of a building on a very busy street with a plaza in front of it. And this would be a day-long event, starting at 9 o'clock in the morning and ending at about 8:30, 9 o'clock in the evening, between the act of whiting out the facade, the erasure of the drawing, and then, well, eventually the erasure of the erased drawing. I was also kind of interested in the different ways that it would be perceived from the public space versus the way it would be perceived inside, as though you're almost hiding behind a jalousie window, and how a space that normally is quite expansive and relates to the public space would all of a sudden become this incredibly claustrophobic space. And this also invited people to move back and forth between the interior and the exterior condition. And here we're seeing just as the erasure is beginning to happen, as the kind of loop of making and unmaking is beginning to repeat itself. And has always been the case, always kind of unexpected phenomena, an inversion of the drawing because of the moisture in the atmosphere that that brings the particulate in the air to cling onto the glass and begin to create a positive version of an otherwise negative drawing. So this as well was documented in a number of different ways. Are you seeing a video on the right? Yes. And if you like, you could take your handheld device, and with the QR code, you could take a picture of that little logo on the left, which will reveal a third documentation. Because it is important to distribute the labor, and you've been sitting there very peacefully for a while, so it's time to participate. And what I think you will find is, in complement to the interior, what I'm calling the architect's view on the right, and the surveillance camera or government view on the left, there you have the kind of embodied laborer's view in your own hands. So another thing that I was really interested in the way this came about was, like Yvonne Rainer, I was actually quite interested in the impossibility of perfection in this work. That the blanc de meudon, which is the white liquid kind of goopy material that gets smeared on a facade when a building's interior is being renovated, is a material that's impossible to control. So there's no way of putting it on in anything but incredibly irregular swirling patterns. And the stencils that were made, because of the slipperiness of the glass, there was absolutely no way that one could put that cardboard T-square and stencil in a stable, stationary, non-slippery way in order to precisely, with a blobby sponge, erase the drawing. So part of the work was also trying to bring up this problematic action of trying to do a good job, but sometimes doing the wrong job and trying to do the wrong job well. But ultimately ending the evening doing a really good job of cleaning the facade and making the whole drawing disappear. And here we see the traces of what little bit did remain. And those objects on the right, I still have with me today. So the last medium I'm going to talk about is the text or the textile. And at the outset of the project, of course, I was looking at one particular kind of text, the executive order. The executive order or the state of emergency law that calls these spatial conditions into being. And in a first iteration, a first performance, which actually took place in the Stunt Gallery at the College of Architecture, Landscape Architecture and Planning, that text/textile appeared as a kind of carpet on which the action was going to transpire. And eventually, this idea of text and textile would, following Gottfried Semper's idea of the textile as the kind of fundamental enclosure, this flexible surface that encloses spaces, I would begin to apply the textile after having explored redacting, erasing, and various other medium, looked into the whiting out as a way of inviting a rewriting of this text, but then also using these banners and components of text to begin to make enclosures, to make small scaled spaces the size of, for instance, the area that one person had to live in within the Japanese American camps, or the textile as applied to the surface of a gallery space, or eventually in the installation of the work reflecting on the identification center in Paris, where there was a very particular text that I was interested in, which was this slippage of the language of the law that had gone from being about acts that people committed to one that was about suspicious behavior. And that there's a term used to describe letters, anonymous letters that might be submitted to a police department or a judge to say, yes, my neighbor is engaged in very suspicious behavior. And these letters, when they are unsigned and undated, as they often are referred to as notes blanches or blank notes. And so in the work reflecting on the Centre d'Identification de Vincennes, the note blanche and that phrase was to become the kind of primary building component to create a series of chamber enclosures and scrim. The carbon copies, the carbon paper, as I had found in the archives, was also going to become a kind of building material, a building material that would actually create a volume about the size of a body. And carbon paper made from letters, those letters I had found in the humanitarian aid workers' archives, talking about the conditions of the men who were detained at the Centre d'Identification de Vincennes, their workplace injuries, their ailments, their very kind of private, personal circumstances are what make up the text on this carbon column. And elsewhere, carbon was also used to transform the constantly changing name and address of this place onto the wall of the exhibition space. But as I said, the note blanche was really the kind of primary object. Thinking about A.L. Weissman's use of this term, the threshold of detectability, and incorporating the text into this enclosure, a series of enclosures, in a way that not only really hovers at this threshold of detectability and really necessitates light or proximity or a certain viewing angle in order for the text to reveal itself, but also once the text does reveal itself, it's very clear that this text has been made not by a machine, but by a very fallible human with all of the mistakes and inconsistencies and errors in the way each one of these tiles comes together. And of course, this three-dimensional quality of the paper would often, call people's fingers to reach out and engage with it in yet another way. Within one of the chambers where one wall was left off, created an opening for somebody to lie down or sit down and actually from that one place have the kind of perfect view of what the camp actually really looked like from that position. And if one were to take the imitation of the mattress and the pillow that was there, one would also find that in the pillow there were murmuring voices, and those being voices extracted from each one of these archives. The government, the police department archives, the humanitarian aid worker, and Monique Herveau, who had lived in La Folie in Nanterre. The last of the components that was actually part of the installation for the work around the CIV were those aerial photographs, which were those original documents that gave me insight into where this mysterious place of unknown location actually would be. And the intention of that was to also engage the body of the visitor to the exhibition space, to the installation, to engage in that sense of uncertainty hovering over this suspended object in order to be able to begin to get a grasp of what this place was and where it was. And there were very, very, very many people every single step along the way who were part of the production of this supported making of this. And I also want to acknowledge their labor in making all of these performances and installations. So I will end my talk there and invite questions, comments. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see all of you. All right, there we go. Okay, there we go.
Thank you, Beth. That was incredible. Really incredible.
Questions, thoughts, provocations, refreshments.
Okay, I have a question. I'll start. I'm guessing that you must have oscillated between a very cerebral and sometimes detective work, like point of view, and at other times you must have gotten really pulled in to the emotional reality of the people who occupied these spaces. How did you move between them? Was it deliberate? Did you have to pull yourself out of one because I can imagine it could be hard at times.
There were many times it was extremely extremely emotional. I think when I got involved in this project, on one level, there was a kind of a bewilderment about how is it that at that point I had lived in this part of the world for 8 years and I had not had a single conversation ever with anybody about the traces of either the Gila camps or the Poston camps, both of which are inside Native American lands, or about the prison camp right here on Mount Lemmon, where conscientious objectors to the war had spent time. So I started more with a kind of a fascination and curiosity about this knot of different forms of invisibility. And while certainly reading the testimonies of people who lived in the Japanese American camps, you sense their frustration, their loss of hope, as well as their hope and their ingenuity in the fact that people got married and had babies and finished high school and did all kinds of things while living in those camps. But it was all very, it was all very accessible, at least through archives, through photographs, and many other things. The Algerian war camp was so much more troubling, partially because of just false information that circulates. It's in history books and various other places about where the place was suspected to be. There's the dilemma that the French are still processing the reality of the Algerian war and are not yet fully owning up to it. There is the reality of the ongoing extreme racism against Algerian and especially young Algerian men. There is the impossibility of accessing half of the information that you would want to access in the archives, which of course is very frustrating. And then when you know that what's actually in those archives are probably horrendous testimonials of people being brutalized and tortured. On one level, it's like, I'm not sure I really want to go there, but there are a couple of documentaries out in which you hear from women whose husbands disappeared. You hear about these stories. So it was quite difficult to manage the emotional aspect of that, but I put that literally into the labor. So hand perforating hundreds of holes in vellum is a really great cathartic action if you want to get your frustration with the way governments brutalize their own citizens. So a lot of these repetitive acts, the labor in a certain sense was a way of modulating and channeling all the kind of really hot and heavy emotional content of the work into something physical, with the idea that hopefully one would sense, with the kind of brutalized surface of the paper, kind of like an analog for the brutalized skin and bodies of the people who were, the victims of the French government's actions. So yeah, I mean, I have to say it was a lot. It was a lot to take on. Aletha, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I do. That was amazing, Beth. It was so inspiring to see at least a short synopsis of the comprehensive work that you undertook over the past few years. And you can really see the sort of personalization of the work just through its you know, its brilliance in a sense. I have 3 questions, I guess. I mean, I'm curious in part, like the methods that you kind of undertook through your doctoral research seem to be kind of overlapping historic archival research and also engaging with methods of artistic practice and making. And I definitely believe like the whole realm of art is one that does expose things that are otherwise unknown to the general public, or things that bring to our attention and heighten attention, like an awareness of things that otherwise we aren't privy to. And I'm curious if like how you perceive these methods and this exploration in your doctoral research, translating into potential teaching practices and teaching pedagogy, and B, into actual practice and architectural practice, since we tend to consider, at least traditionally, consider our realm of the architecture discipline as a professional practice. Like, what does that actually mean, and how do you see it differently? How do you see it shaping it differently based on your work? And then the third question is, you did about the like other philosophers that really inspired you through your process. You touched upon a few. I know in the essence of time, probably limited that, but I'm curious just on these whole aspects of labor. You know, if you were focusing on Hannah Arendt's political philosophies, or you know, Marxist kind of socialist. Social economics and labor. I'm just curious to hear a little more about those and expand on that a bit.
So, okay, I'll start with the last question. I'll go backwards because just as a kind of funny anecdote. So imagine that from August until November of 2017, my kitchen was a factory for brick production. And my living room was the shred zone, and my side yard was the drying yard. And every day I would spend an hour and a quarter to an hour and a half, 2 hours making bricks. And the entirety of the time that I did that, I listened to David Harvey's lectures on Marx, Volume 1. And so this notion of labor time, and another book that was important was this notion of also the traditions of reading while people labored. So this idea of having good books read to me while I was engaged in physical labor, so that I was always working between this kind of headiness and like the fists gnashing pulp and wheat paste in a bucket for an hour and a half every day. Or, you know, some of that was making wheat paste, some of that was shredding, some of that was mashing, some of it was molding and things like that. So there was definitely a labor side to that. And I would add, in addition to Hannah Arendt, and this is somebody John Mackenzie would know, Bojana Kunst's book, The Artist at Work. And really, and this is where the idea of not just the invisible labor, which is the way we usually think about it, but she writes about the hypervisibility of the contemporary artist, who is constantly having to tweet and Instagram and constantly in an act of self-promotion and looking for the next gig. And ironically, you know, as I'm reading her description of the hypervisible artist of today's world, who's working always on projects and residencies in the future, it's like, that sounds an awful lot like an architect's work, because it's always contingent on a site, a series of relationships, it's got a place, it's in the future, there are proposals. It's not just like you go into your studio and you paint every day. It's always, there's always this kind of projective act. So there were a series of people that I was reading in relationship to labor, and on the architectural side, of course, Peggy Deemer featured largely there. There were a number of people I was reading in relationship to ideas of spatial politics and the camps, so Giorgio Agamben in relationship to the camps, and Jacques Rancière's writing about the sensible, the distribution of the sensible, the distribution of sensory experience. And if you are living in the slummy part of town working 2 jobs, what you experience as part of your sensory world, your aesthetic experience, is going to be very different from somebody who does not have the same forms of labor and economic conditions. So those were kind of, I would say, key people I was constantly referring to. And then there were a lot of artists either who were explicitly exploring visibility and invisibility erasure, so people like Jenny Holzer, but then also people who are exploring invisibility performatively. And I would say the kind of most like close to my heart in that group is Doris Salcedo, who has done a lot of work that is also highly political. So in fact, all of the artists whose work I was looking at in terms of erasure and invisibility, all of it had some kind of political thread running through it. So to go back to your first question, I would say in terms of architectural practice and pedagogy, I mean, if nothing else, I think I'm much more attentive to modes of representation, like whose point of view is this? What is the medium, and what is the medium hiding? And what is the medium foregrounding? So that's a little bit of A.L. Weissman, thinking about the threshold of detectability through media, which may also say, perhaps on some levels I'm as interested in the forensic as in the projective. And I think that when we do site analysis as architects, there are other ways of doing site analysis that really attends to the erased and the invisible. And that there are also ways of conducting site analysis that has to do with the embodied experience and narratives and other kinds of points of view that can inform the way we think about sites. So I don't know if that hit all 3 of your questions.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
Beth, there are many comments in the chat, but there's one question from Jim Sawyer. You are clearly concerned about the lives of those who are made invisible. Do you have any insights while doing this work as to what we can do now and is happening now?
I have been thinking about that a lot. And this is where I think this question of who made that image, who is the author, who wrote that text, whose point of view is it? Whose point of view is it not? Who's not part of the story? Whose perspective is not being told? And we deal so much with mediation, images, drawings, text, plans. So I think one of the things is to think about both who are we not seeing, both the people who theoretically we are serving, as well as the laborers and all of the other parties who are involved in the making of the work. And then there's also, and to go back to Kiel Mo's talk the other day, I think one of the other things is to not just think this line, this arrow between here's my client who gives me a brief and here's the work, but thinking all of the externalities of like, where did that material come from before and where is it going to go and how is it going to be reused and who's going to be involved in the maintenance of the building and who's going to be involved in the making of the building. And I think the more we start to just look under the carpet and say, who and what is being swept underneath the carpet or being treated as a kind of externality, like a disposable condition, the more we will start to dismantle the kind of, the kind of repressive hierarchies that we're currently operating in and have been operating in for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So thanks, Jim, for a great question.
I think that seems like a good thought to end on.
So
Seeing.
let me just put one last thing out there, and I will put this in the chat window to everybody if I can get it there, which is that if anybody, especially some of those friends who are way on the other side of the planet, who are here or just around the corner, I would like to invite anybody who wants to just continue to hang out and have a larger conversation, that we meet shortly in another not recorded Zoom window for an informal happy hour or coffee hour, whatever the hour may happen to be, wherever you are. So thank you everybody for great questions and for coming this evening. And thank you, Nancy, for inviting me to share my work 6 months ago and giving me this opportunity to do so. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Beth.
Thank you.
Great.